Hi, I'm Scott Leadingham. Thanks for joining us here in the unique Northwest. Today we are with Enrique Pérez de la Rosa, Yakima Valley correspondent. Thanks for joining us today, Enrique.
My pleasure.
Yogi Berra, the great baseball philosopher, supposedly once said, "It's déjà vu all over again," and you might apply that situation to what's going on in Yakima. More specifically, the city of Yakima was once sued, and now the county of Yakima may be sued for a very similar thing. Enrique is here to unpack it. What's up with that, Enrique?
So, like in the city of Yakima, this is all about the election system. Back in 2012, several civil rights groups, including the ACLU of Washington, sued the city of Yakima because they ran this voting system in where candidates had to go through their districts and get through there and then head into general elections citywide. And so what that meant is that in Latino majority districts, they would put forward a Latino candidate, and then the white majority in the city would vote that candidate down. And that's an important aspect because that's kind of the claim that One America is making against the county, is that racialized voting is really affecting their election system, which is pretty much exactly the same as the city of Yakima's. The city of Yakima lost that lawsuit back in 2014, and they had to redraw their districts. And so now there's a question of what is the county supposed to do to kind of fix this system that, again, is very similar to what we saw in 2012 and was redrawn in 2015.
Okay, so we should be clear that what we're talking about at the moment is a potential lawsuit or the threat of a lawsuit against Yakima County. The city issue has already been resolved in federal court. Okay, so but there, again, that's just a threat of a lawsuit. There hasn't actually been anything filed yet. Is there any indication that the county might respond in such a way to fix things before an actual drawn-out legal fight takes place?
Well, county leadership has not commented to the media. All they've said is that they're reviewing the letter sent by One America with legal counsel to basically draw out their options and see what they're going to do. One America actually proposed a change that would avoid a lawsuit. The county could institute what's called a ranked voting system, wherein voters, instead of picking their favorite candidate in the primary and then picking another candidate in the general election, would only vote once, but would rank all their candidates in order of their preference. And so what that would allow the county to do is essentially run the election again and again and again until they get their candidates to office. If a candidate reaches a certain threshold of votes, they get elected. If they go past that threshold, then those votes get recounted and redistributed based on second preferences. And then if no candidates get to the threshold again, the candidate with the lowest amount of votes gets eliminated as if they'd never run, and then those votes get redistributed based on third preferences or second preferences.
All right, yes, so it sounds a little convoluted, but other jurisdictions and states have sort of tested the waters or are thinking about testing the waters, but that's a little ways off. Just to go back a little bit, you talked about One America. Explain a little bit, just briefly, what is One America?
One America is a Seattle-based immigrant rights organization, and they've been heavily involved with the lawsuit in the city of Yakima, and also with a proposal in the city of Yakima to institute a strong mayor proposal. They're seen here as kind of outsiders, though they do have local advocates and local people that they work with here, but they are very heavily involved in getting immigrants voting rights.
Okay, right. So going back to the ranked choice voting system, it's something that's somewhat obscure. Not a lot of people have probably heard about it, or maybe they've heard about it kind of in an academic sense, but not really seen it employed. Why would it specifically help an area like Yakima County or the city of Yakima that is very, Latino heavy, as opposed to any other place? If it's a good idea there, why isn't it a good idea everywhere, frankly?
That's a really interesting question, because it might be a great idea everywhere. It's a system that allows voters to just vote for the candidate that they like and not necessarily take into consideration what's the likelihood that this person is actually going to win, because they get to put in their second choice and their third choice. So it allows for more people to run and have a probability of getting votes. It changes how candidates run. It isn't about getting the most votes. It's about getting higher on people's ranked list. So it really changes the dynamics of how elections are run. Here specifically, the One America is proposing that the county of Yakima do a ranked voting system either in districts or in county-wide. So it doesn't really matter what direction the county goes in, although if they go county-wide, then they wouldn't have to redraw districts, which would be cheaper in the long run. But really, the ranked voting system is the thing that One America is proposing because it gives voters more voice, essentially.
Interesting. We'll certainly be following that as you help keep us informed as it develops. All right, staying in the Yakima Valley, but let's talk about another Yakima spelled differently with an A, Yakama Nation, as in the Native American tribe. So you recently reported on some very interesting history about a tribal historian, an interpreter named Louis Mann, and how his descendants are now getting to hear his voice from over 100 years ago based on some archived recordings that have been uncovered and restored. Tell us more about the history there.
Yeah, so Louis Mann, he wasn't a tribal chief or wasn't a leader of the tribe. He was an interpreter back in the early 1900s. At this point in time, the Yakama Nation was very young. The treaty was signed in 1855. And this was a time when the United States, the tribe, and the new state of Washington were trying to figure out their relationship. And so Louis Mann was kind of like this link between tribal leadership at the Yakama Nation and elected government officials in Washington, D.C. and Olympia. And that's really how he saw his role, according to his family, not as a leader, but as this link between two nations. But he really had his own strong voice, which can be seen in letters to the Bureau of Reclamation. He wrote to President Calvin Coolidge as well. And he's really seen as this strong person who fought for tribal rights for the Yakama Nation.
And we are hearing his voice again because of these archived recordings that have been restored, like I said, and also seeing him again because he had actually been photographed by photographers at the time who were kind of from outside the Yakama Nation and were kind of, documenting people of the West at the time. But in some of your reporting, you brought up the notion that there's some, I don't know what the right word might be, problematic. We hear that term a lot applied these days in terms of just maybe how the subjects of these recordings and the photographs were sort of treated by, kind of the white historians and documentors who were coming through at the time. Talk a little about what some of those concerns were at the time and still are now.
Right. So you're right. We're hearing about him because local historian Emily Washines, who's a Yakama Nation tribal member, found these recordings that were in wax cylinders, very delicate things that had actually survived 100+ years. But Louis Mann's family didn't know about these recordings. These were recordings that were taken by famed photographer Edward Curtis, who was traveling the country photographing Native Americans. And those recordings and the photographs he took were taken away from tribal members, and they were, they're in museums, they're in archives, and so that brings up the question: what do those institutions do now with those materials? Because there are people like Alvin Schuster, who is a descendant of Louis Mann, who didn't know about the recordings. So it's a very kind of problematic because those materials are seen as property of those family members, of those descendants. And actually, Louis Mann's recordings, there are 6 that survived. 4 of them are ceremonial songs, and I haven't gotten to listen to them yet because they're meant to be sung in the context of funerals and private things like that. And so it's kind of giving people a chance to relearn these songs that have kind of been lost to time. There's also this question of, the Edward Curtis is a very controversial figure because when he photographed Native Americans, he kind of romanticized them and painted them as a dying people, which is not true. And it's actually, he didn't photograph Louis Mann because Louis Mann would dress in a suit and tie as an interpreter, he wanted to portray a certain image when he went to Olympia in D.C. And so that takes into there's this question of how do you reckon with these materials and the people who collected them, but still make that connection with your ancestors.
Well, it's interesting history, an interesting story, and we thank you for helping inform the broader Northwest about it. Enrique, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
See more of Enrique's reporting on these and other topics at nwpb.org. Thank you for joining us here in the unique Northwest.